Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you to my panel for being here tonight. I'm going to do a quick intro. Phal, am I pronouncing your name right? And I'm sorry, I use my phone for my notes, so
we've done the same.
Oh, good. So I'm not checking my emails.
Yeah, I do exactly. My notes are exactly like that as well. I'm going to be doing that in a minute.
So Kate is a professor of arts and literacy at Manchester Metropolitan University. Her work is concerned with listening to the voices of children and young people through co-production methodologies. She is currently the principal investigator of a project about children and young people and treescapes entitled Voices of the Future. She is particularly interested in intergenerational communicative practices within multilingual families and researching with a focus on multilingualism. Her book, Living Literacies, Literacy for Social Change, 2020, with Jennifer Rousel, explores this work. Next, we have Nobila Bano, am I pronouncing that?
Yes.
Is an early career researcher with a background working as a lecturer in post-16 education. At present, she is pursuing a full-time PhD within a wider research project named Voices of the Future, UK Treescapes, using innovative participatory methods, working with intergenerational South Asian families and located in Northwest England context. Her research aims to explore the role of intergenerational knowledge transfer in mediating migrant background young people's relations within the natural environment. Next we have Dr Marilene Ribeiro, is a visual artist and researcher from Brazil who lives and works in the UK. Her practice is focused on the environmental and human rights agendas with a decolonial gaze from the global south. Her projects are engaged in the political agency of photography and in the role of image-based media in society. She was trained by Magnum Photos and the Central St Martin's as part of University of the Arts in London and holds a PhD in Creative Arts awarded by the University for the Creative Arts in the UK. She's currently a research associate at the University of Manchester. Ribeiro has been nominated on the PH Museum as one of the 12 women photographers to watch worldwide, and she has works exhibited internationally and articles featuring her work published on platforms dedicated to photography, such as PhotoWorks, the Royal Photographic Society Journal, Lens Culture, Visc Projects, and Viavois. And last but not least, Professor Stephen Scott Bottoms. Stephen is Professor of Contemporary Theatre and Performance at the University of Manchester. As well as being the author of several books and numerous scholarly articles, he is a practicing theatre maker and storyteller. For the last decade, his research has involved the exploration of water and climate issues through performances built from direct engagement with communities and professional stakeholders. In 2021, Steve's short play, This Island's Mine, toured up the Leeds-Liverpool Canal on a barge in support of the Air Rivers Trust's DN-Air project. Steve is currently co-chair of the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission's Adaptation and Resilience Panel, and in that role devised the participatory show Who You're Gonna Call in Event of Emergency in 2022. His most recent solo performance is The Boxer's Guide to Climate Resilience 2023, commissioned by JBA Consulting. So I'm just going to say a few words about why we brought this amazing group together. Within my Leviathan project, of which this exhibition forms a part, I've been working since 2015 with a number of scientists, particularly thinking through where human and marine ecologies intertwine, and trying to think about how to tease out, essential frontline research that should be better known through the arts. For a while now, I think maybe having done that since 2015, I've gained a bit more confidence in art's role in having those conversations and how it brings it out of academia and peer-reviewed journals into community-based practices. So this is the first panel where I wanted to bring a series of serious practitioners within the arts, but who are working at that axiom with climate, water, forests, and also working with communities in ways that are of great interest to me, because I think that's how we actually change anything. I'm going to then hand it over to each of our panel to just do a short intro to their work, but particularly their process. I'm really interested in how each of us in different ways takes our knowledge and our process out to the world, and I think uses that as a process of learning ourselves. So Kate, would you be happy to kick us off?
Yeah, thank you. It's so exciting, Niels, to do this, and I'd just like to say thank you to everybody for asking me. And it's also summer solstice day, and I've got friends who will be swimming up in Gaddings Down in Cognaton later tonight, and it's where I live in Hebden Bridge. I sometimes don't close the blinds because the light's amazing at this time. So I'm going to talk about the Voices of the Future Treescapes project, and I've invited Nobila along because I felt it was important that Nobila came too. So I'm not going to talk forever because Nobila's talking as well. This project was funded by something called the UK Treescapes programme, which was set up after COP26, where it was clear that we need to plant like literally millions more trees. We have forested area in the UK of 13%, that's really low, and the trees that we need to plant also have a dual function in that they're combating the climate emergency, in that they take in carbon dioxide and store it in their roots. I've learned this from my scientists, and breathe out oxygen. So in our application, which we very luckily got, we argue that young people are the people who are going to have to deal with the climate crisis. And I love just looping into your work, I love the focus on hope, because one of the things we've done is layer our project with ideas of hope, but also thinking about what young people are going to have to do. And I think the climate scientists are quite scary about what they're going to have to do, but that's what our project's about. So we're doing a co-production approach, and I'm going to give you some vignettes from the project in a minute. And we're working in interdisciplinary ways with scientists who are laser scanning below ground tree cover to look at how much carbon trees are taking out of the atmosphere. We're measuring trees in hundreds of different ways, which I'm going to talk about later. And we are also working in collaboration with our partners, Mersey Forest, Manchester City of Trees, and many others. It's actually our project spans Aberdeen. I made my team go up Dennehy and the Cairngorms last year. And we're also working closely with DEFRA, who amazingly recently we had 3 migrant young men come and talk to DEFRA about their tree planting needs from Ethiopia, Sudan and Afghanistan. So we're trying to reshape practice both in education and in policy. So this is just a little snippet of what we've been doing. I described the young people that we're working with, their recent arrivals under the care of the Manchester City Council looked after team. Caitlin Nunn, who's not here, does amazing work with them, and you've met them and I've met them. They're such a great group of people, and they've become our co-researchers. So they run a research group called the Tree of Hope group, and you'd have loved to meet them actually. They're just amazing people, and they call their group after the Oda tree group, which is a tree found in Ethiopia, which is a bit like a sycamore. And in about 2 weeks' time, we're all going to take cars and go to a festival called Wild Rumpus, and they've done a multilingual soundscape, which actually was done in Hebden Bridge, listening to the water. So that's another link to yours. We've done a study of youth activists in the UK, across the UK, which is an amazing study, and one of the things they say is that we don't get buttressed enough to do the work. It's lovely to hear about the activism that you captured. It was just very moving. But young people are pressed for time. They don't have enough money to be activists. They're not given lots of support. We looked particularly at Black and ethnic minority organisation activists in that study. We've also co-designed woodlands with young people. We planted 900 trees in a school in Bolton. Freezing cold it was, because it has to be done before 31st of March. And the young people co-designed the treescape in their grounds, and they've also been measuring trees. Measuring trees is really interesting. So we've got really sort of hardcore scientists doing laser scanning and also diameter tape measuring. But we found there are lots of ways to measure a tree. You can climb it, you can put your hands up it, you can hug it. And actually the children and the trees have started to have a relationship between each other when they try and look at the tree. And the reason I did this project, actually, I was so related to that amazing person who had his hand on the tree and was banging it, was that I put my hand on a tree on my grandfather has a farm in the West Country, who's died, but and it's got new people in it, but it has this lovely old oak tree, and the oak tree literally spoke to me that we need to actually have that relational thing with trees. What have we found out? I'm nearly finished. We found out that children, young people, and trees are quite similar. So they both, we did a thing last week with the UK treescape series. What is a child and what is a tree? We worked out they were really similar. They both grow, they both have roots, they both move, they need carbon dioxide and oxygen, but not quite in the same way. And they're made of water and they help each other out. And we've done a project in Stratford, doing it at the moment, where the young people have been having conversations with trees and using those wooden kind of listening devices to listen to them. What we have found that young people are very curious about trees. They've been curious about worms, mud, climbing trees, finding bugs, lying under a tree, listening to trees speak. And I think what we're trying to do is quite similar to yours actually, which is to try and create a kind of lexicon of experience from this project that recognises that there's very complex ways in which trees can teach us about the world. So that's my little intro, and I'm handing over to Nobila, who's the star. I was the pre-star in this.
Hi everybody, my name's Nobila. It's great to be here today. I'm really excited about being in Touchstones in particular. It's a place I call home. I'm a proud resident of Rochdale actually. I've lived and worked here my entire life. I've got some really fond memories of imparting wisdom upon young people as a lecturer in post-16 education, just down the road from Touchstones actually, so yeah. I guess I'm here today not as a teacher, but I'm very fortunate to be a proud researcher through the Voices of the Future UK Tree Six programme and as a doctoral student here today. I guess the next 5 minutes of this space is just me having a chat aloud about some of the concepts that I've been grappling with over the course of the year and really locating these across some of the broader themes of Shezad's films that we've just seen, and also situating this in the context of Rochdale. So there are some really prominent themes that I've derived from your film actually that resonate with me personally and also my research project. So I think the part that speaks to me is this concept of migration, belonging and the natural world. And that's a huge prominent theme that situates and resonates throughout my PhD study. So for instance, as a researcher, I'm really interested in the complex nuances that derive between looking at family relationships and nature, and particularly of how migration histories of Indigenous and diverse people and diverse communities, looking into these histories and understanding what shapes our wider socio-cultural framings of nature in terms of the lens of looking at identity and belonging, how people connect and feel disconnected to nature. So I guess this concept of nature being this living guide to knowledge in some cultures really resonates with me. For instance, the ancestral knowledge of connecting with nature, the previous histories of diverse communities, what nature meant to them, how it was lived, how it was practiced. Can this and does this inform our current and present relationship with the natural environment? And I guess really in my project and through my own lived experiences of being a second generation migrant background person, I can connect with these in a number of broad ways actually. So for me as a researcher, I'm interested in the intergenerational aspects of connecting with nature through diverse communities and lenses. So as I mentioned, I am a second generation migrant background person who derives from South Asian heritage. I guess observations on my own family and nature reveal some real distinct generational differences in how the natural environment is lived and practiced and understood across generations. So for instance, I have overseas born parents who came to the UK in the late 70s. I observed my own parents in nature, and one with a very pragmatic and functional relationship with nature, and on the other side another parent who connects very differently, social and emotive. For instance, on a family walk, it could be a particular shrub or tree that kind of takes them back in time to their rural upbringings overseas. And I guess these different nuances of family relationships, looking at migration, history, and looking at this from the lens of identity and belonging, how people connect differently to nature, really resonates with me, and I've got a really keen area and interest to explore this further. So I guess this sparked an initial enthusiasm for me to kind of learn more about nature through this lens. So my PhD project is located in Rochdale, so it seeks to explore how migrant background young people of South Asian heritage and their families connect with the natural environment. For me, I'm very interested in the intergenerational aspect of connecting, being and doing in nature. I guess you might be thinking, so how do I propose on investigating some of these themes in a very tangible manner? So using a number of situated and participatory approaches, working specifically with 4 families of migrant background heritage over a 6-month period, who are residents of Rochdale. The idea is that we are exploring nature encounters across urban parks, nature sites situated in and around areas of Rochdale. I guess one really innovative method that speaks to me is this concept of walking and talking. I'm really inspired by the works of Maggie O'Neill and Hubbard, this concept of walking alongside, along with, talking as a means of a reciprocal engagement process, this avenue of creating really powerful platforms to kind of engage people and enable them to be able to tell their own stories of what does it mean to be a migrant background person of South Asian heritage connected from nature, and what can we learn from this. I feel that there's so much we can learn from this to inform our, wider socio-cultural framings of nature and looking at the diversity of communities in this manner. So I guess you might be thinking, what is the impact of a study like this in Rochdale? I guess really for me as a researcher and being a diverse person in academia, it's really about shining light on the diverse perspectives of connecting with nature through encounters, this being a potential avenue to advocate positive societal changes. I guess for Rochdale, in terms of a geographical location, this study has the potential to offer new ways of understanding into the connectiveness of human culture and nature amongst underrepresented migrant background, community groups living in Rochdale. I feel that there may be scope to uncover some opportunities for some migrant background communities situated in Rochdale to be able to sustain and develop the natural environment into the future. And I guess really in terms of Rochdale and where I fit in with this, as I mentioned, I'm a proud resident of Rochdale. I've lived and worked here my entire life. I think for me, in terms of the academic sense, it's drawing attention to some of the really positive things that are happening in Rochdale and challenging this systemic, to some degree, white Western bias that we may have about certain communities being detached from nature and understanding that their experiences are different, but it's celebrating that difference and diversity in the outdoors. So yeah, that's me in a very broad nutshell. So thank you very much for listening. And yeah, I guess thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to start with that for everyone who's here today to listen to us, and for the invite as well from Shezad Studio and from Touchstones. I'm gonna try to be brief about the work I've been doing, because I've been doing this for a long time, and then we've got a lot to think about and to say as well. But I'm going to concentrate based on your experiences with collaboration and with kind of these interrelation between nature, all the elements of nature and human beings, because we're also an element of nature. We forget about it. We keep forgetting about this, but we are part of it. I think it would be nice if we could focus on 2, 3, 4 projects that I've been developing. One is the current project I'm developing as part of a research at the University of Manchester, which is also part of the Future of UK Treescapes.
Is that the Castor one?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh yes, I love Castor. Yeah, we were with them last week.
Okay, cool.
Beavers.
Yeah, exactly. The conference.
Riparian.
In Cardiff.
Yeah.
Then these projects, the project about future, and I've been also working about present, past, and thinking about future as well, and other projects. But these projects is a project that is starting now, and it's called, it's an interdisciplinary project which involves 6 universities across the UK, and it's also interested in understanding the past, present, and future of the landscape. But we focus specifically on treescapes along the rivers. And my role in this project which is the visual art beat of the project. It's about how we can learn from lived experiences of the people of the valleys, how we can learn from them, how we can learn from the experience they have had in the area that they live, the connections, the way they interrelate with nature, and how we can transpose these kind of experience together using our background as artists to visual form, to communicate these, to think together about future scenarios for the area and for this treescape of the UK altogether, in terms of like how we can change from 13% to 17% by 2050, which is like tomorrow, isn't it? It's a quite short time frame. And also I've been bringing all these other experiences I have had working with other topics about climate change, global warming, and geopolitics, especially regarding the global south and the global north, these relationship. And for that purpose, like in order to reflect about what we human beings and what corporations, geopolitics, what kind of role they have had in the planet we're living nowadays, and what we can do about the future times, reflecting from what we've got in the present and what we've learned from the past. I've been working with local communities, riverine communities, riverside dwellers in Brazil, to understand and to communicate the social and ecological impacts of hydropower in my country, specifically in Brazil, but actually it's kind of a window to a problem that's overspread, like widespread. And it's been a big issue for the 21st century because it's been kind of a discourse for the fight against climate change and global warming. And yet now we are trying to give another perspective for this discourse, which is driven basically by very authoritarian systems of corporations and interests and business as usual. And basically these work that I developed in collaboration with these communities in different parts of Brazil and remote areas who have been impacted by hydropower plants and projects in different times. It's basically about how they perceive the environment that they live in, because they have lived along the rivers for generations, and how they want to communicate the impact that these ventures have done in their lives and the lives of their communities, so that we can understand a bit better about the other side of hydropower projects. The other side of the propaganda of the hydropower projects that's been like kind of, it's going to save us from global warming, it's the best solution. And these kind of projects, like they generated like a film which is called Costs, a video installation which is called This Is My Home, which was done based on videos of one of those participants that collaborated with me in this project. And it's a book, an artist's book, and an exhibition which is called That Water, which puts together and intertwines all these different forms of communicating through visuals. This is a story that they told me and they were shared from the moment that I was with them. And what I've learned from all these moments and all this time with these people in different situations, like from the remote areas in Brazil to the Colne Valley here, the northern England, is that first of all, listening, it's such an important thing, isn't it? Like kind of having this moment of listening to learn, and not just to listen to the people who live in the area and who has got so much to contribute to all this debate about what we've been doing to this planet, to the other living beings, but also to kind of show paths about how we can be doing different for us to pursue something different in future times, to like kind of envisage something that's going to be different and better for all life forms, not just human beings, as your film brilliantly conceives and just gives to us these kind of reflections. Then I've learned that listening to these people, and not just to the people, but listening to the places as well, to the environment, going there, being there, enduring the climate, enduring the change that you can see happening there, different times, the mosquitoes, the heat, the code, how the other beings interact and respond to these. It gives to us such an amazing way of understanding in a broader way and in a deeper way. And another thing that I learned from my experience with these people and these places is that we can try to work towards a different future. And I think that visual arts and photography, in my case, which is my expertise, has got such an amazing way of making people reflect on this in a different way and touching people in a different way. And I'm telling this not just because I understand this, but based on the responses and the feedback that I have had from people who have seen the videos, the exhibition, the papers, and all the opportunities that I had to interact with the audience, and they could give me feedback. It has proven me that it's got a way of touching and making people reflect on all these subjects that are so important for our future times. So thank you very much. I think I spoke too much. Yeah, I'm trying to be brief. And I'm gonna pass the word to Steve.
Okay. Hello. Thank you for inviting us, Shezad. Thank you for that amazing film, which I want us to talk about. But anyway, so you want us to talk about ourselves. So I suppose I'm a storyteller. I'll tell a little story. So a number of years ago, my background is as a kind of theatre director and also a theatre historian, and those two things were kind of parallel but pretty unconnected. And at a certain point I was bored with all that, and I went, the climate is on fire. This was 15 years ago probably, and it really is now. And what can I do? Because what use am I? So I was interested in site-specific performance, which is where you make work that is outside in the environment. I've directed a number of plays in that way, but it seemed to me that nobody ever used that to talk about the actual environment. It was usually like local history or adaptations of Shakespeare plays or whatever. And so I got a network grant to have a series of conversations in particular locations around the UK, one in Scotland near Faslane Nuclear Base, one in Fountains Abbey in North Yorkshire, one in central London. So very different kinds of environment, but we tried to talk about a bunch of academics from my field and artists who got together to talk about the possible relationships between site-specific, looking at sites and how they're changing and performing that in order to better understand what we're talking about. And the upshot of that was that, sorry, this is getting long-winded already, somebody came from the Environment Agency to talk at the London session and said, this is all very well, this nice academic conversation you're having, but can you do something useful with it? And can you use it to raise awareness of flood risk in communities that are at risk of flooding? And a bunch of my colleagues went, why would we do that? Because that sounds very instrumentalised. And I said, well, it's a very interesting question, and it's probably the wrong question, but what if we try asking it, we might figure out what the right question is. So I got another grant to do a project that we called Multi-Story Water, where we went and worked specifically with communities in Shipley and Bradford and in Eastford and Bristol, kind of parallel project. I did the Bradford end, and we tried to contact people living, communities who were considered to be at flood risk. Now this is much harder than you might think, because traditionally if you do applied arts, you go to a community centre or a church or wherever it is and you find a group of people who are already there. But if you want to address people who are at flood risk, you have to look at the flood maps and literally go door to door and knock on their door and go, do you know you're at flood risk? Okay. And anyway, the really interesting part of this was that the Environment Agency had told us that people weren't aware of their environment because we're all so disconnected now, right? And it very quickly became clear that the people we were speaking to were perfectly well aware of what the river was going to do because they'd seen it come and go before, and actually were much more aware of how much risk they were at than the Environment Agency were with their flood maps, because the flood maps often turn out to be quite inaccurate. And local knowledge often is superior to the sort of external digital knowledge that's been gathered through models. So that was interesting, but also people didn't really want to talk about flooding. What we found was the way to get into those conversations was to talk about all the different relationships that people had with water, with the river. They wanted to talk about how the river had recovered since the mills closed, for example, even though the mills closing had killed the local economy, and but now you see kingfish, and you don't see great swathes of suds coming downstream from the dye house and all the rest of it. And so we built a series of performances that were based around a kind of multiplicity of narratives that people had in that area, both immediate and sort of going back in history a little bit, and kind of did it as a site-specific piece that kind of toured up the length of the catchment in Shipley. And that led then to a longer project because it became, we're really interested in talking in more detail with these communities and how connected they were or weren't with the water environment. And we worked with a local community centre specifically to look at 3 community areas that were considered, high on the multiple deprivation indices, okay, which is what the Environment Agency calls hard to reach communities. Now, they're not actually very hard to reach at all. You go and knock on their door and they talk to you, right? The people who are hard to reach are the people who live in gated flat communities with flats, and you buzz their buzzers, and they never come because I'm off in Leeds doing my high-paying job or whatever, So that's interesting in itself. That, and somewhere in the middle of all this, it dawned on me that the community that really needed to be addressed was people like the people in the Environment Agency, or the people in the local councils, or the people who work for the Canal and River Trust, and so on. That there was actually a community of professional stakeholders who were really kind of disconnected with the communities that they served in many ways, and with each other, because I was in a bunch of meetings with them, and they always seemed to be inviting the same people to these meetings from different organisations, but there was always somebody's agenda that was driving the meeting. And so it became this very transactional thing of well, what am I getting out of this meeting and why am I here? And so I said, what if we just invent a kind of dialogue project where we get a bunch of you together, maybe on a monthly basis, is what happened, and we'll have meetings where we just talk and there is no agenda. And they went, that would be great. I thought they'd say,
no way.
Yeah, no, exactly. They were, oh, that's great. Oh, great, art. and it turns out that these people are kind of crying out for different ways of approaching stuff than that kind of normal technical kind of bureaucratic thing that they do most of the time. And actually that project then went on monthly for 3 years, a year after the funded project had finished, because they asked us to keep talking. That explains why I'm subsequently become involved in the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission, which is like all of the local councils, the Environment Agency, lots and lots of different organisations, including Drax, which is the biggest polluter in the country, but let's not go there. And they're trying to unpack how you make regional level change in all this, but it's all anyway. So then I make performances about that after I've talked to people in that mix, and that's my last one-man show. Who are you going to call? Last but one now, because I've just premiered a new piece that was made for an environmental consulting agency, because they saw the last piece and went, oh, can you make one for us that's about our model of climate resilience? So it's a really weird process whereby, so I did that in the National Flood and Coast Conference a couple of weeks ago, and it's a half-hour storytelling piece where I play King Canute talking to a woman called Jo, all right? It's set in a coastal town called Made Up Town. It's completely ridiculous, but it's based on stuff that they told me in interviews. And the people loved this, and they were like, oh, this is really innovative. And I'm like, no, it's a half-hour storytelling piece. But in their world, it's innovative. And now, apparently, I'm told that there's conversations at policy level about, using more of this kind of thing, right? And so I just it's flattering, and also I want to laugh. But my point is, there is an absolute, as Shezad was saying, there's an absolute need for the arts, for films, for stories, for plays, for whatever it is, because people need to humanise these issues. And one of the things that has most struck me doing this piece, Who Are You Going to Call, is people have come up to, it's really bleak, actually, this piece. It's based on a bunch of interviews with people who work as sustainability staff, and usually they're completely on their own in these organisations. And they've been, I'm the one person in my organisation of 20,000 people who's responsible for saving the planet, and everybody else expects me to just get on with that, and they'll do what they're doing. So it's a really desperate situation. But the interesting thing is that people having seen this piece, they come up to me and go, "Thank you, it's given me some hope." And I go, "Why is it giving you hope?" And they go, "Because there's a sense that it's being talked about and there's emotional stuff being explored, because I think so many of us have this low-level anxiety about all this stuff, and nobody talks about it socially because it's just like considered really gauche, or if you do talk about it, you get angry at corporations and capitalism in general or whatever it is, right? And that's not very helpful. So actually to kind of process, to create creative circumstances where people can kind of process this stuff in some way, I think is fundamentally important. Whether it be through planting trees or creating photographic situations or whatever it is, I think all of that is basically what that is trying to do in different ways. Anyway, sorry, I'm rambling.
Fantastic, thanks, Stephen. Thanks, everyone. That's it's funny because I should share that me and my team in the studio have been studying what each of you do, and for all the reading time I put into it, I've got more of an understanding from sitting and hearing it from each of you directly. And that probably brings me to the sort of first question I wanted to ask, because actually, and I think you've all talked to it a bit, but I wanted to sort of get to the nub of it. And, how much of a difference do you feel it makes to actually be in a room with people? In a room with people, whether that's groups you're working with, stakeholders, in all the different ways you're working in different projects, I suppose there's a double question in there. What difference does it make, and what got you to get out and start doing that in the first place? Should we just start with Kenny?
No, I love that question, because I recently had to write about what my distinctive practice is for a really boring UKRI thing. And I realised what I love to do is get a philosopher who works on hope, a chartered studies person, an ecologist and tree measuring person, me and Samia, the RA I work with, all in one space in a school in Bolton, all with a group of children who themselves have designed this woodland, and the children are planting trees, but doing it all at the same time. So one of the things I love is creating, I think somebody else talked about this, the site generates the ideas. And I think the thing that I've found really helpful, we talked about co-production earlier, is getting everybody into the site. So that and then I got everybody to write field notes, like the tree measuring, we did the tree measuring recently in Bolton. Everyone did different field notes, so we presented it at the UK Treescapes programme actually, and they're so different. But it's that being together that's really important. And with the DEFRA visit to York, the guy showed up, and the 3 young people were at the station, and he took us on a walk around York's walls. And then what was amazing, he just sat and listened to the young people talk for about 2 hours. He was amazing, this guy at DEFRA. And he let them be slow, which is amazing, because I think so many civil servants, I work with civil servants quite a lot, they like everything to be really quick, and preferably in a slide pack. We once did a film, this is in Rotherham, with a group of young people about how they felt distant from government. They made this shadow puppet film, we gave it to the DCLG, and they never watched it. And then the Rotherham thing happened. There was this trauma in Rotherham. And we said, well, it was all in the film, but you didn't watch it. But that thing of actually time and slowness. So one of the things I really like about all of your stories actually is that you emphasise the kind of weighting of the work, that it's just not, you can't kind of rush through it, but also it's about the site. I'm going to stop now because I want to hear what everyone else says.
Would anybody like to pick up on that, or I could move on to another question?
I mean, I'm happy to follow that. I mean, I'm a theatre maker, so I would always say that being in the room is important, but because that's what we do. And there's always a big difference between something on film and something that's actually, live bodies. But in terms of that idea of taking time, I think that's when you're working with communities of whatever sort, be it a kind of geographic community or a community of interest, if you like. I think taking the time is the most important thing. It's taken me years to build up some of the relationships that I'm working with now, and so all the little kind of creative outputs along the way are kind of to my mind, just expressions of a point in time along that journey, but as the journey is actually the most important part of it, if you will.
I might jump onto another question, which I think, Nobila, you kind of hit on something that I'm very interested in, and I think it came up, you know, in the background as well of what other people were saying. But I was going to ask about time travel as a way of talking to people, but talking through ancestral knowledge and talking about the planet, because you've got so many layers of time kind of actually occurring simultaneously. And I think, you know, that you and Marilene also, you know, touched on that quite poetically, but I just wanted to tease out a bit more about your point of view.
Yeah, I think in terms of my project and my wider thinking surrounding time, and I think storytelling narratives is a powerful form of retaining and learning about ancestral knowledge. Like, for instance, in my project, working with migrant background families and the generational aspects of being and doing and learning about nature, one of the really pivotal parts of my study, and I think there's value in this, is creating opportunities for family dialogues to emerge, and that could be situated in the natural environment, or it could be about the natural environment. But I guess it's about storytelling and this kind of travelling through time and spatial context, and I think it's quite fascinating that you mentioned that. But it's something that I'm very interested in, this way of storytelling, and I've noticed just by observing, I haven't started collecting my field research in nature yet, but I think what's interesting at the moment is just walking and talking with groups of people in and around Rochdale through facilitated, you know, forestry school events in the local community, is storytelling being this natural thing that emerges through walking and talking. And a lot of people is like, oh, you know, I learned about this through the natural environment from my grandparent, and I share that on family walks with my children. So I guess part of keeping memories alive through this ancestral way of being and knowing and understanding nature through that diverse lens across time and spatial context, a means of having that available could be through storytelling narratives. And I found, just from my observations, not collecting data, but just immersing myself in these walking and talking groups, is that it's a prominent theme that naturally does emerge when people walk and talk with you. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. And does it answer your question? Okay,
beautiful.
Good. Okay, good to know.
Marilene, would you like to pick up on that?
Yeah, my work is a lot political. Then let me try to frame this now, as you said. Because I think visual arts, I think storytelling, as you were saying, there's not just visual, but in the written form as well, we can do that. We've got a kind of a power of bringing things that have been happening repeatedly in different ways, in different sites, different geographies, and put them together so that people can kind of open kind of a map, and that they can see them all happening at the same time. And I think this is quite beautiful in a way that it enables people to understand the bigger picture. Because we didn't live in the past, we didn't live like before we were born. We're not going to live in the future, they're not going to be here anymore as like an individual. And once we've got this power of kind of bringing these things all together so that people can understand this extended time frame in a kind of concise space, which is the artwork. I think this is beautiful, because then we can understand what's been happening. Like I'm talking about in terms of, for instance, of hydropower, for instance, a project. The thing started like in the 50s, last century, and it's been developing, the kind of building up in different ways, in different sizes. But when I was investigating this story repeats and repeats and repeats. It's a violation that repeats and repeats. Like in China, in India, in Brazil, in the United States, here as well at some point. But when you put this all together in one single piece, people look and say, oh my goodness, this has been happening, you know? And the same thing for the people we work with. Sometimes they don't have like kind of an idea about what they've been collecting as their personal and family stories as well. And once you like leave them these kind of open this space for them to share, and for you to start kind of collecting these things with them, and eventually showing them, look what we can construct with all this lived experience you've got and your ancestors have got as well, and how we can like kind of narrate something, like chronicle something in such a rich way, you know, like bringing like films things that they video like ages ago, things that they've been like kind of collecting from their parents, grandparents, and we put this all together, their own narratives, anecdotes. And when we put this together in a kind of an art piece, you just look and say, oh my goodness, but these all the knowledge I've got, and I wasn't able to access it because it was daily base, it was daily life, isn't it? The person is living that. And that's what I think there's like a nice thing about art in these terms, or not just visual art, but written, in the written form as well, because I can make a book out of this as well, we can write about that. Yeah, that's my understanding about like how we can shape time in a different way, bring it like things.
I was going to go on to ask a little bit about, because it was touched on in different ways by each of you, but you know, an idea of working with specific communities. And you know, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot in the last maybe year or two is, you know, the idea of ancestral knowledge, that it's both indigenous and migrant. You know what I mean? That often you get this sort of false polarization between the migrant or the indigenous, whereas actually, you know, it's a continuum. And I guess I was interested in how, in different ways, you're all working with communities to tease out, you know. I was very interested in Stephen, what you had to say about, actually it was the people in the gated community, or the sort of stakeholders who were asking you to do the work with other people who actually needed it mirrored back at them. I was just wondering if, Kate, did you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, one of the things I've often done with children is we did a listening exercise at the beginning of the Voice of the Future project, where we asked them to draw what they knew about trees. And we had some beautiful stories. They were year 3, 4 in Old Trafford and Bolton, about grandparents. And grandparents always feature in my fieldwork. I remember my first study was in Barnsley, and it was like dead pets and dead grandparents, almost the same level of trauma. I mean, really, no, it's the trauma of your dog dying is really serious. Rabbits. But I think one of the things that came over was also the stories. So we actually have got an audio tape of a child describing the death of her grandmother in Pakistan, which is actually really affecting in the knowledge collecting. And she was talking about breathing. And I've listened to this many times, but one of the things that I realise it connects to is the children are also very interested in the trees breathing. So the trees, because we're working with these scientists, they've got this thing, when you ask them about trees, they go, they breathe in carbon dioxide, they will say, and it's not actually quite accurate. They breathe out oxygen. But the story of the grandmother dying, which is actually really affecting to listen to, is also a story of breathing. And that's quite a deep example, but it's just came to me when we were talking, which is that in many ways, the arc of your film, Going Back to the Film, is all about birth and death, which I found really moving. But it's also about life and what it looks like across the spectrum of humans and non-humans. I'm going to stop there because I think that's enough talking.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, Shezad, from the film that we watched was the heartbeat and the rhythmatic movements of the heartbeat. I think it resonated with me in the respect of, I was thinking about walking and talking and the rhythmatic movements of feet and patterns of walking and what they may unearth about the temporalities of walking in terms of walking with, walking alongside. So yeah, that was an interesting space, and I connected with that when I heard the movements, and I started thinking immediately about my project and this concept of walking with families through nature sites in and around Rochdale, and what walking patterns could teach us about some of the narratives that unfold and the ways that they are told and be told. and that generational lens, are there different walking patterns between different members of a first generation or a second, perhaps a third? So yeah, that's just talking out loud, Shezad. So
I mean, that connects, before I move on to ask the others, I mean, that idea for me, and you know, and I think it's maybe where art in whatever form gets a bit closer than academia to kind of to communicating to audiences, because it's more visceral and tactile. But I think, you know, that idea of tree climbing or touch, you know, when you touch the non-human, you give yourself to it, and that's in a way maybe the easiest way to access ancestral knowledge. You know, I mean, you know, trees being hundreds of years old. I mean, one of my favourites, in my research, I was speaking to somebody from the Greenland Centre for Climate Change, and you know, we got onto the subject of the Greenlandic shark. Does anybody know the Greenlandic shark? The Greenlandic shark is one of the longest-lived, animals on the planet. I don't know if she's still with us, but when I was last in dialogue with this researcher in Greenland, the oldest living female Greenlandic shark had been alive at the time of Shakespeare. And, you know, and I love those ideas that totally, you know, explode the human timescale and some of the narratives we get stuck in, you know, and particularly, you know, Steve, when you're talking about corporate stakeholders or hydroelectric power and...
Yeah, but also, like, when you just talk to people about their memories, you realise how much change there has been just within really very short, you know. So this work in Shipley, I made a piece that was about this micro community called Dock Field, which is in Shipley, and it's sandwiched between the canal and the river, and Bradford Beck, which flows into the river. So it's like a little island almost. So the piece was called This Island's Mine. And what I was really interested in, it's basically an industrial estate with housing in it. Okay, so I wanted to talk to people about what it was like to grow up in this particular very kind of actually quite deprived working class community surrounded by water. And the stories that came out were, a lot of them were to do with, as kids, you know, this is middle-aged people talking about how as kids they would just charge around the place, you know, up into the glen and, you know, kind of all swimming in the canal, which they weren't meant to do, but they called it the Leeds Liverpool Lido, which I loved, and all this stuff. So there's memories of play as kids, which just doesn't happen now because people are so much more protective of their children. I mean, maybe you're discovering something different, which would be great, but and so that in itself resonated then with audiences when they're like, oh yeah, do you remember when we used to do this and that and the other? But also other stuff like the fact that none of these houses ever had central heating in them, which is a relatively new phenomenon still. I put the first central heating in a flat I had in Glasgow a couple of decades ago. And so they would talk about how absolutely freezing cold as kids it was in these attic bedrooms as they were growing up, and how it was like an igloo and there'd be ice condensation on the roof and so on. And they're having those conversations, and then these people would be going, but it doesn't get like that now. And then it'd be like, oh, you'd say that's climate change, wouldn't you? Saying this is like in a pub, and I'm like, I didn't say anything about climate change. You said that, and you know, and these. So it's that thing of just like working through living memory, and people going, oh my God, yes, things are changing, and things have been changing, and where are we now, and what's it going to be like, you know? But it's a very kind of human way of dealing with those kinds of issues. I think it's just to explore that lived experience, because it as opposed to, you know, numbers on a graph or whatever it is. You know?
Marilene, do you have
No, I was just agreeing with him when he was talking about the thing of the one generation.
Oh, and sorry, I meant to say, you said about migration. So the reason that play ended up on a barge, it was a tabletop piece, because we told the story of that community through building, you know, drawing a map on the tabletop and putting ordinary objects on it to represent different bits in that thing. And it turned out that as a result, this micro story, this one place, actually resonated in lots of other places, because when you tell it, then people want to talk about how it is or isn't like theirs. And so we toured it up the canal on a boat, sponsored by the Air Rivers Trust, because they were doing this project about migratory fish coming back to the river as a result of a project they've been doing to put fish passes on all the old industrial weirs, right? So there's this restoration of natural heritage. And for me, that all fit, because what we were talking about was also the sort of the unknown or unheard heritage of the community itself, you know, and actually the play was about, you know, two people, one of whom had always lived in that place and the other whom had grown up and gone away and had come back but didn't know if they could come back. You know, so migration was built into that as well, because it's just what people do on a daily basis, as well as obviously there have been global patterns. There's those very local patterns of like, I left, can I go home again? You know, so sorry, rambling away.
I wonder, should we open it up? Does anybody have questions from the audience?
Just not really one question, but I guess a reflection. It's been great hearing you talk about that research and ways of working, but you know, the importance of listening and opening up the conversation with the various different groups that you've been working with. I work for your trust and Touchstones, and we've been doing a lot over the last 5 years around co-creation and trying to shift the power dynamic and allow our communities to make decisions about what happens in this space and the projects that we develop. And yeah, it's just really great to hear you all talking about the sensitivity and the openness and the way that you're kind of, you know, working with the groups that you are. But also it's kind of reaffirmed my belief in the role that art and culture can play in the climate agenda and the issues. Sorry, it's a bit of a, but it's just been great hearing about your research.
Thanks very much.
Well, yeah, I'm overwhelmed by, in a very good way, about the many teams that you are talking about and the interconnections. And there was a few things that popped up, like having time to slow down. I just actually wrote a book about slowing down. And the time to listen, the time to care, the time to look at. And this intergenerational experiences that we are actually not passing on, that gap, the amnesia that we are suffering from, not just as we born and then as we get old, but this intergenerational please.
Intergenerational.
That's it.
Thank you. I say in Portuguese would be easier. So we are not communicating, so there's another team, the communication between people, the no time to listen, the opportunities that don't exist. And I actually had the opportunity to listen to one of the videos about another talk that happened, I cannot remember when. It was in one night I couldn't sleep. And I was listening to you and other people, and there was a photographer as well that I think lived down in Cornwall, and I was saying how people are forgetting. So that one generation remembers the environment where there was a lot of trees, there was a lot of marine life and birds and all that. And now, for example, a teenager will look and, oh, actually, that's amazing, a sheep and a bunch of sheep and a grass, and it's almost empty. So actually, are we normalizing because we don't know how things were? And that where you were talking about, you're actually bringing past and multi-geographical areas to show us actually, oh, this was different than it is now. So are we actually suffering from an amnesia intergenerational amnesia, and so I think you are doing a great job by putting all this together and getting people to talk and to communicate. Sorry, this was mostly like a reflection that I will take actually to myself. Are we forgetting? Are we all with Alzheimer's, like dementia in that sense?
I think that's a really good point. When you were talking, I was thinking, what is that amnesia about? And one of the things that happened when I started doing this project is I met with City of Trees, Manchester City of Trees, and the guy in charge of Pete Stringer talked about an example where they planted 2,000 trees in Wigan, and overnight they were all taken out, which is quite common, both City of Trees and Mersey Forest. But one of the things you realise is that part of it is that people don't have that experience of planting trees at all in their daily life a lot of the time. And so actually our work with children planting trees and measuring trees and engaging in trees is something that, like, the school curriculum doesn't have time for it. We've got really amazing schools that let us do that, but basically they don't have time for it. And the forest schools, people that we work with in Bolton and Aberdeen, would like to infuse that knowledge that you described all the way through the curriculum. But right now it's really hard in schools to do that. We've just been lucky, but it's very hard to get that into the mainstream curriculum. So I think we've got quite a crisis, actually, about how young people's knowledge and understanding of treescapes is then going to be taken into mainstream schooling. And I don't want to be depressing, but I do think the space of schooling is getting really tight. But it's what we want to do next year is to create lots of resources for children and young people to use with the aid of Mersey Forest, who we love. And also they're going to write the strategic plan for Mersey Forest children and young people. So kind of try and engage that sense of ownership and belonging. But the other thing is, when I started being in this world, I'm not really from this world, of trees, all the keynote conference speakers were landowners, titled, some of them. And or Prince Charles is, well, he was like, but you know, it was like people with land, because people with land are the only people who actually have access, apart from people going to parks, to woodlands by and large. So it's a kind of whole politics of land. Sorry, I'm soapboxing now. You can tell me.
No, I'm enjoying it.
And one of the things around that is, because you mentioned that obviously trees breathe differently, but also one of the functions they serve is that they soak up a lot of moisture. And so one of the things that a lot of people are looking at in terms of flood risk defences for cities is to plant a lot more trees further upstream to stop the water flowing down. And then you get into these arguments with farmers about, well, am I going to give up my fields for you to plant trees in, or do whatever else? And so there's this really kind of complicated politics around all of that gets really interesting.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
This is for anybody who would just like to take it. I was lucky enough to be part of a research team with Professor Nigel King at the University of Huddersfield this year. And the research was looking into the facilitators of nature with minority and underrepresented groups. And the data collection happened around the time after the COVID-19 lockdowns. And some of the preliminary findings was COVID-19 played a huge role in people's access to and connection to nature, because we worked alongside canal trusts and councils within the Huddersfield area, and these trusts was basically doing like cleaning the canal, and what we found was that COVID-19 had a huge impact in people reconnecting with nature. And I was wondering, with any of you guys, A, have you been lucky enough to collect any data from the lockdown time? And B, do you think that lockdown will navigate the direction for people's connected with nature for the future?
I think if I think about my own experience of connecting and reconnecting with nature during the pandemic, at the time I was a teacher lecturing further education, and I think for me I was looking for spaces actively of just detoxing and just, you know, finding a digital detox and away from the confinements of a room, for instance, you know, remote teaching. I guess I'm fortunate, I'm here with my sister. Hello, sister. So, you know, we're fortunate to have had so many experiences of connecting with nature from a very young age. It's something our parents did and encouraged, but I am mindful that it's not the reality for many people from our wider ancestral community. So I guess personally, in terms of reconnecting and connecting with nature, maybe it was the fact that I was actively seeking and looking for new, you know, spaces in and around Rochdale. But I guess my own data collection hasn't started. It's just my own observations of me in that space, but I found a different way to connect with nature than I had done in the past. So I don't know if that answers your question in relation to what you were asking.
You know, outdoors was seen as a safe space, so everybody
yeah. And I think a lot of people, not just me, particularly teachers working and anyone working from home, were looking, actively seeking spaces to just be away from, you know, the confinements of a room. And yeah, people naturally sought out green spaces, but it's about having access to them as well, and the degree to which it fits in with your lifestyle and your work patterns during that lockdown. So I don't know if it was the same of people's experiences in inner city areas and the role. I think it depends on very much where you live and have got access to nature, really. You know, if for instance, if we're talking about marginalised communities, statistically a lot of them, you know, live in inner city areas, you know, where the opportunities to explore green spaces are not that many in some respects. So I guess it's about having access to it to some degree, and yeah.
Thank you.
I think there are my own perspective on COVID-19. Actually, I think one thing that might have happened is like that people, perhaps now, some people, as she said, some people might be valuing in a different way natural spaces. And perhaps this could be a good moment for us to claim this space to carry on existing. Because people started valuing them because they needed them. Because at some point they said, oh, we need nature. I cannot be in my room the whole day. I mean, but on the other hand, the amount of single-use things that we've been producing due to COVID-19, the amount of masks we've been using and putting in nature, these for me, it's really getting to me. Like I was the one that were like, okay, I'm gonna reuse this mask because I'm not gonna put this in nature. And the single-use stuff as well, like, you know, like deliveries. And I mean, the amount, if you're gonna contabilize this, if you would be able to contabilize what was this kind of impact of COVID in nature overall, I think it's a massive impact. Like in just 2 years, all the deliveries, everyone putting everything in plastics, and this crazy thing about you would use gel, and then people would offer you a single-use glove for you to touch things in space. It's like, I'm using hand sanitizer already. Why do I need to use a single-use for me to touch the thing to get the bread and then to put in the bin afterwards? Then in these terms, I think COVID was kind of a very bad thing for the environment in terms of the amount of things we put in the landfills, in the ocean, of single-use stuff.
And one of the interviewees from my Who You're Going to Call piece works in the NHS, and she said that was a wake-up call, COVID, because they realised they were getting through so many of these disposable masks, and they always had, but like it was off the chart with COVID, and so they did an assessment. So the NHS through the pandemic got through 3 billion disposable face masks. Okay, and every one of them is made from plastic, which comes from oil, you know. So it's all climate related, and most of them are being shipped across the world from, you know. And some of them, it turned out, were being made by slaves in China and stuff like this. So like that's forced a lot of these NHS trusts to reconsider what, you know, where they're sourcing their materials from, or to put in place like reusable mask policies and stuff like that. So yes, it's awful, but it's also kind of forced some change as well. But to answer your question, more directly, the boat tour piece that I mentioned was made specifically So there's the performance, and then we have a conversation with the people who are sitting around the table at the end of the performance. That's how it's made. And we did it right after, so it's like the autumn of 2021, so it's right after everybody's coming out of COVID, but a lot of people were still wearing masks watching the show, even though there was airflow through the boat and all of this. But over and over again, the conversations that came after that were about how people have just got out and about much more in nature through, because of COVID and so on. And we did capture some of that actually in people who were writing kind of note cards and attaching them to this map that we had to kind of document the different places we were moving through. So there was that, but of course it's a self-selecting sample. And the flip of that is that I think a lot of people barely left their houses through lockdown and stuff. And you've got, I don't know about UK with your students, but we've got a real problem with a generation of students, some of whom are just don't want to attend classes even because they barely come out of their rooms. There's real mental health issues there, so that there's ups and there's absolute downs as well. So.
Shall we call time? I think that's been a very long and productive and generative discussion. And I definitely had a list of other questions I could have gone on with, but I think I'm just going to thank everyone for being here tonight and giving your time to kind of open up and be questioned and open up about your practice and your work. And please feel free to ask any questions sort of more informally afterwards. So thanks again. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Nobila. Thank you, Marilene. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you.